Everybody, it's Mauricio Raoul, and thank you so much for requesting this special report from the real estate guys. Really, really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys get a ton of value from this. In fact, one of my goals this upcoming year is to double, if not triple, my value that I give to the real estate syndication community. So hopefully this is a good start. What I'm about to show you is an excerpt from a presentation I did called Practicing Safe Syndications, where I go through what I believe are the three most important things that you've got to think about when you're doing the syndication, at least from a legal standpoint. So hopefully this will add some value to you. For those of you who don't know, I am the founder and CEO of Premier Law Group, and what we do is we provide syndication services for real estate investors. We are syndication attorneys. We have done all of the syndications for Robert and Russ for the last, 10, 15 years now. And in fact, I've been on their show quite a bit. And so I encourage you to check the archives to see those episodes. And of course, I'm on the faculty of the Secrets of Successful Syndication, teaching the legal stuff. So hopefully, if you haven't gone to that event, I would highly recommend it. So with that, let's take a look at the excerpt here. But today, I just really wanted to hit the highlights of that presentation. Again, I wanted to talk about the top three things. But before we talk about the top three things, let's start with probably a discussion that I'm not going to go into too much detail, but one thing that we talk a lot about when we first talk to clients when they're raising capital is essentially, are you dealing with a security? That's probably the first question we need to ask for. A lot of times people think that if you're not selling, shares in a corporation or membership interest in an LLC, somehow there's a side deal, whether it's a loan or it's a profit sharing agreement or it's some kind of a side contract, that somehow they're not dealing with a security and we can bypass all of the securities laws, which of course that is not the case. So I'm going to assume for purposes of this presentation that we are dealing with a security, but just as a recap, anytime you take money from someone and you manage the money where the returns are gained by your work, you do the work and that's how the returns are gained, you are dealing with a security. Therefore, you could be doing a TIC arrangement where you kind of bypass the LLCs, you can do profit sharing agreements, loans. Those are all securities because the return is based on your work and your efforts. And anytime that happens, you are dealing with a security. So it's an important point to keep in mind. And again, for today's purposes, I'm going to assume that you are doing a traditional multifamily apartment complex. You're created some kind of an LLC or some corporate structure, and you're issuing shares or LLC interest or maybe partnership interest in an entity. And we are dealing with a security, which means, of course, once we deal with a security, we are now bound to follow the dreaded securities laws. And what I want to do right now is go through these three items, mostly to sort of demystify, because the securities laws are a little bit technical, but that's not your job, right? The job of the technician part is for me, for the attorney or whoever you're using as an attorney. What I want to make sure you get by the time we're done with this section is have an idea from the context standpoint, like where does it fit in with all of your other components of putting the raise together. And more importantly, I want you to be able to have an intelligent conversation with your attorney or your practitioner so that you don't get lost when you're talking to them. So three things I always like to start with is, number one, hopefully you can read this. If you are dealing with a security, there's only three things that you need to worry about. Number one is you need to register your syndication, or number two, you need to find an exemption, hopefully I'm spelling that right, an exemption to registration, or, well, let's do a red one actually, I'm not sure how well you guys could see the green one, or number three, it's illegal. These are your parameters. You either register the syndication, you find an exemption, or it's illegal. It's that simple. Now, I always kind of joke with people that I'm going to assume that you don't want to be doing anything illegal, and I kind of cross that out. But remember, when we're talking about illegality, we're not talking about Bernie Madoff, right? We're not talking about committing fraud, although obviously those items are illegal. But in our world, most of my clients, where we try and be careful is the lack of disclosure. That's where you could have an illegal offering, is if you fail to disclose all of the material information in your documentation or in your presentation. Okay, I always joke with people, you can structure your syndication however you want, so long as you disclose. And the failure to disclose especially when it comes to compensation, by the way. You can get compensated anywhere you want, but if you fail to disclose some sort of indirect compensation, or certainly direct, then you are engaged in an illegal offering. So let's assume we don't want to do illegal offerings, and we'll make sure we keep you out of jail, so to speak. The odds of you going to jail, I still think, are pretty slim. You can register your syndication. We also don't want to register the syndication. And the reason why is that when you register your syndication, it's going to take you a minimum of 12 months, and it could take up to 24 months. And it'll cost you anywhere from $100,000 up to, I've got a client who did it for $1 million. So, those of you out there, how many of you have the luxury of waiting 12 to 24 months for the government to respond to your registration, or want to spend 6 figures while you guys get in a contract? I'm guessing not. The reason why it takes so long is because you're dealing with the government, right? You're submitting all of your registration documentations to the federal government through the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and then you've got to go to each individual state and deal with this at the state level, all of the states that you're planning on submitting the syndication. So we don't want to register the syndication. We don't want to do an illegal offering, which leaves us where most of us live in the securities world, which is we want to find an exemption to registration. And the exemption is really where I live. This is my world. And luckily for us, there's a couple of exemptions that are fairly easy to fall into. And as long as we know what they are, we should be fine in terms of not worrying about registration. And I'll make sure that you don't do an illegal offering. Oops. So let's go through. Again, this is, I'm going to hit the highlights. So I'm going to talk to you about, oh, that didn't go very well. I'm going to talk to you about, that's all informal over here, right? I'm going to talk to you about the #1 exemption that everyone uses, not everyone uses, but about 90 to 95% of people in the world of securities use what's called a Rule 506. And there's really 2 reasons why 90 to 95%, and almost 100% in my particular case, use 506. And that is, #1, it's a safe harbor. Meaning if you hit all of the points that we're going to go through right now and comply with all these requirements, and they're very simple, then it's a safe harbor. You have complied with the exemption, and we don't have to worry about anybody challenging it. You hit those points, you have complied with your exemption to registration. And second of all, maybe more important to that, is that it preempts state law. And what does preemption mean? It means essentially we don't have to worry about all of the states. So we are exempt from federal registration, and then all we need to do with the states is give them a notice filing, say, hey, Mr. California, Mr. Illinois, Mr. Florida, or Mrs. Florida, I guess. We did the syndication, and I'm giving you notice that we did it, but there's no requirement for us to comply with their securities laws so long as we've complied with the federal. Now, the one exception is the fraud. There's still the anti-fraud provision. So again, you can't be Bernie Madoff. If you're Bernie Madoff and California and Florida are still going to come after you. But other than that, if we hit these points, we're going to be fine, and we're going to have an exemption to registration. So let's go through the main points, or maybe all of the points from this, because this is the meat and potatoes here. So #1, the nice thing about Rule 506 is you can raise unlimited funds. This is why even the Goldman Sachs and JP Morgans of the world use 506, because there's no restriction. You can raise $1 billion, or you can raise $1 million, and you can rely on Rule 506. By the way, the average raise of syndicators, according to the SEC, is 1.1 million. So a lot of you think that you're not raising a lot of money, but an average is 1.1. The next thing, which is very nice about 506, is that you can accept non-accredited investors. Now, you are limited to only 35 non-accrediteds, but it does allow you to take 35 non-accredited investors. Now, what is an accredited investor? It is simply someone who either earns $200,000 a year for the last 2 years with a reasonable expectation of earning that same amount this year, or has $1 million in net worth excluding their home residence. So if you are that makes you an accredited investor. A lot of people who start out, they're going to their friends, their families, their acquaintances, and a lot of them end up being non-accredited. And so under 506, we are okay to accept non-accredited investors. We're just limited to 35, which in most cases is not a big deal. The third, what color are we on here? Red. The third item we want to highlight, and this is one of the major restrictions of it, which we've got to be very careful about, is that there is no general solicitation and no advertising. So in order to take advantage of this exemption, we cannot advertise, we cannot solicit. What is solicitation? Going to a conference room or a conference and setting up a booth or handing out your business plan to people you've never met before. Essentially, it means you've got to have a pre-existing relationship with your investor. And that's not always the case, but it's a good generality. If you have a pre-existing relationship with your prospect, then you're not engaged in advertising, not engaging in solicitation because you already know them. So we've got to be very careful about that. Number 4, let's go back to blue. As we mentioned before, there is this is a safe harbor, which is very key. This is one of the main reasons people don't like to use the other exemptions. I mean, if you Google around, you can Google 504, 505, even Reg A. All of them may be attractive on the surface, but when you look deeper, you'll notice that there's a safe harbor. Yeah, sorry, a safe harbor. You'll notice that you have to still worry about dealing with the states, and that's where it becomes time-consuming and, more importantly, probably expensive. And the last item that I want to highlight is we file a Form D. Hopefully, you can see that on the bottom, and it's not cut off. But a Form D, and that's your notice requirement that we discussed earlier. This is where you essentially fill out a form with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is free. You've got to do that within 15 days of raising your first dollar. And then you take a copy of that Form D and you send it in to the states to let them know, hey, we've raised all this money, or we intend to raise all this money in your state. And of course, what the states really want is their fee. So depending on what state you are, you're looking at registration fees anywhere from $100 to $500 per state. But that's another element of here. This is what the world looked like until very recently, but as many of you may know, there's been an important lifting of one of these restrictions, and that has the restriction of, excuse me, the no solicitation and advertising. So now, if you've heard, you are now allowed to solicit and advertise, which is a brand new exemption, essentially what they came up with. And this is called now 506C. So what we just went through is 506B. They now created a new exemption called 506C, which they've just essentially made 1.5 tweaks. The first one is they lifted the prohibition against general solicitation or advertising. Right? Game changer for most people. Now you're not limited to people you have pre-existing relationships with. You can go out there and you can put an ad in the Super Bowl for all you care, or you can put Facebook ads, or you can put together seminars. You can do basically anything you want in order to advertise your deal. The only restriction you really have is that you can no longer take non-accredited investors. You can only take accredited investors only. So that's a major limitation. More importantly, you must take reasonable steps to verify. Let me repeat that. Reasonable steps to verify that your investors are indeed accredited. In the old days under 506B, when you were not allowed to advertise, and by the way, 506B still is in existence, and to be honest with you, most of my clients still rely on that exemption. But with that exemption, I'm sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. With that exemption, you can rely on their representation, right? You can give them a questionnaire, you can check the box and say, hey, yes, I'm accredited, and you can rely on that representation. With 506C, since now we're talking to people we've never met before, we're not allowed to rely on the representation. We must take reasonable steps to verify, which in essence means you're looking at tax returns, you're looking at appraisals, if you're looking at net worth, you're looking at all these sort of tax documentation that will prove to you that, hey, yes, this guy says he's accredited, and I believe him. There are several services out there which I've always recommended to my client because they do the verification for you. And because of that, you don't have to deal with that compliance nightmare of asking people you barely know or maybe not know at all for balance statements and tax returns. There are services, law firms, brokers that will do it for a very, very, very reasonable cost. We're talking $75, I would say, on average per investor. So
You get 10 investors, you're talking about, $750, $1,000 to do the verification. To me, you put that in your budget and you have somebody else deal with that nastiness of having to call up people and say, hey, I need a copy of your tax return because, or a copy of your W-2 because you're claiming that you make $250,000 or $300,000.
And there you have it. Hopefully you found some value in the video. And if you're looking for more of these types of videos, I highly recommend you check out and like my Facebook page, Mauricio J. Raoul. And hopefully I'll see you at one of the upcoming events.